Hi, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today we will talk about I.A. Richards' book, Practical Criticism. Practical Criticism, 1929. I.A. Richards, 1893-1979. I.A. Richards' full name is Ivor Armstrong Richard. Was a pioneering English literary critic, theorist, and a poet renowned for founding the New Criticism movement along with T.S. Eliot and William Emerson. He emphasized the close reading and the analysis of literary texts independent of historical and authorial context, focusing instead on language, tone, and meaning. His influential works, such as Principles of Literary Criticism 1924 and Practical Criticism 1929, introduced the systematic methods for evaluating literature and understanding readers' responses. Richards also contributed to semantics and the psychology of reading, laying the groundwork for modern literary theory and interdisciplinary approaches to literature. I.A. Richards' Practical Criticism is a landmark work that transforms literary criticism into a practical, text-centered discipline, emphasizing close reading, the avoidance of subjective bias, and a careful attention to language. By providing empirical evidence of common misreadings and proposing rigorous analytical methods, Richards revolutionized how readers and critics approach poetry. Though its limitations have been acknowledged, its foundational concepts about language, ambiguity, and the reader-text relationships continue to shape literary studies today. Background and inspiration for the work. I.A. Richards was a pioneering literary critic and educator, deeply interested in improving the way poetry and literature was taught and understood. His work, Practical Criticism, emerged from his work at a Cambridge University, where he observed students struggling to interpret poems objectively, often influenced by external knowledge or personal biases. The book was inspired by the need to shift literary criticism from biographical or historical approaches to a more text-centered empirical method. Richards sought to make literary criticism a practical skill, teachable through direct engagement with the text, rather than abstract theorizing or reliance on authorial intent. Explanation of the title. The term practical criticism emphasizes hands-on active engagement with the literary text. It contrasts with theoretical criticism, which focuses on abstract principles, literary history, or philosophy. Richards advocates criticism as a practical activity, careful, close readings and interpretation based solely on the text itself without external context or presuppositions. Structure and divisions of the work. Practical criticism is primarily structured around introduction and methodology, presentation of experimental data, analysis of responses, theoretical implications, guidelines for criticism, etc. Introduction and methodology explains the aims and rationale behind a practical criticism. Presentation of experimental data. Richards conducted empirical tests by giving students poems to analyze without a context, collecting their responses. Analysis of responses. He examined the misunderstandings, confusions, and interpretive difficulties students encountered. Theoretical implications. Richards drew conclusions about the nature of language, poetry, and the meaning based on these practical observations. Guidelines for criticism. Finally, Richards proposed a method for improving critical reading and interpretation. Key arguments and concepts. Focus on the text. Meaning should be derived directly from the words and structure of the poem itself, not from autobiography, history, or outside knowledge. Critics and readers must approach texts impartially, suspending preconceptions to avoid a distortion of meaning. The intentional fallacy, precursor concept. Although the term intentional fallacy was later formally coined by Wimsatt and Beardsley, Richards already stressed that critics should not rely on authorial intention as the primary source of meaning. Meaning arises from the interaction between text and the reader. The role of ambiguity. Poetry often contains deliberate ambiguity. Richards argues that readers should recognize and appreciate ambiguity rather than trying to force a single correct interpretation. Ambiguity enriches the text and invites multiple valid readings. The problem of misreading. Richards showed that readers commonly misunderstand poems because of faulty assumptions, emotional biases, or linguistic confusion. He emphasized the need to clarify language and cultivate careful, attentive reading habits. The importance of close reading. Detailed attention to poetic devices like meter, rhyme, syntax, imagery, and sound reveals layers of meaning. Close reading is essential to grasp how form and content interact to produce meaning. Now let's go to the detailed division by summary. Introduction and a methodology. Richards outlines the shortcomings of traditional literary criticism, over-reliance on external data, vague aesthetic judgment, and a lack of systematic method. He introduces practical criticism as a more scientific, empirical approach focusing on the text itself. Experimental tests. Richards presented poems to students unfamiliar with the authors or context and asked for written interpretations. These blind readings produced many misunderstandings, which Richards analyzed to identify common patterns of error. Analysis of misinterpretations. Misreadings often arose from ambiguous words, complex syntax, or emotionally charged responses. Richards identifies types of interpretive errors: oversimplification, projection of personal feelings, literalizing metaphors, and ignoring nuances of language. The nature of language in poetry. Poetry uses language differently from ordinary prose. It relies on connotation, rhythm, and evocative power. Richards discusses semantic values, that is, the multiple shades of meaning words can have in a poetic context. Recommendations for criticism. Richards advocates teaching readers to think through poems carefully, dissecting language and form. He suggests critics should become aware of their own biases and work to minimize distortion. He encourages appreciation of poetic complexity, including paradox, irony, and ambiguity. Now let's analyze the themes of practical criticism. Objectivity in literary interpretation, emphasizing unbiased text-based reading. Reader-text interaction. Meaning is created through the reader's engagement with the text, but guided by the text's internal cues. Language complexity. A language is inherently unstable and rich, requiring careful unpacking. Educational reform calls for improved methods to teach literature, focusing on skill building rather than memorization or external trivia. Now let's analyze the current relevance of higher research as a practical criticism. Practical criticism remains foundational in literary studies, particularly in the development of new criticism in the mid-20th century, which dominated Anglo-American literary theory for decades. The focus on close reading and textual analysis continues to be a core component of literary pedagogy worldwide. In today's context, it serves as a reminder to prioritize the text and a direct engagement over overly theoretical or ideological approaches. However, it is also critiqued for sidelining historical, cultural, and authorial context, which later theories like new historicism, reader response, and post-textualism have sought to reincorporate. Despite this, Richard's insights into ambiguity, linguistic complexity, and the pitfalls of subjective bias remain vital for critical thinking and interpretive discipline. The influence of the work on a later criticism. Practical criticism laid the groundwork for the new criticism movement. Example, Clean Brooke, John Crow Ransom, which dominated mid-century literary studies and inspired close reading techniques, which focuses intensely on the formal elements of text. His empirical approach to studying reader response anticipated modern cognitive and psychological approaches to literature. Now let's analyze the main quotes from the essay. The only way to get at the meaning of a poem is to concentrate on the words of the poem themselves. This quote stresses the core idea of practical criticism. Interpretation must come directly from the text rather than external sources. It urges readers to engage closely with the poem's language. This approach helps prevent a misinterpretation caused by preconceived notions or irrelevant background information. Now the next quote. Every reader brings a personal bias which interferes with an impartial understanding of the poem. I. Richards acknowledges the inevitability of a subjective bias, but warns against allowing it to cloud interpretation. Recognizing this bias is the first step toward a more objective reading. The quote emphasizes self-awareness in criticism to achieve a clearer understanding of the text. Now the next quote. The poem must be dealt with as a complete and autonomous work. This highlights the idea that a poem should be studied independently of the author's life or historical context. It advocates for treating the poem as a self-contained unit. This principle helped shift criticism towards close textual analysis. Now the next quote. Ambiguity is not a defect, but a source of richness in poetry. I. Richards values ambiguity for its ability to invite multiple interpretations and a deepen meaning. Instead of forcing a single correct meaning, readers should appreciate the poem's layered possibilities. This insight encourages openness and flexibility in reading. Now the next quote. Meaning is not something in the poem, but it arises from the interaction between reader and text. This anticipates reader response theory by emphasizing the role of the reader in constructing meaning. It suggests that meaning is dynamic and relational, not fixed or solely author determined. This fosters an active rather than passive engagement with the poetry. Now the next quote. Misreadings often occur because the reader tries to impose everyday language usage on a poetic language. Richards points out that poetry uses language differently, often metaphorically or rhythmically. Readers must adjust their expectations and interpret language according to poetic conventions. This helps avoid simplistic or literal misunderstandings. Now the next quote. The critic's task is to clarify confusion, not to impose personal judgments. Richard sees criticism as an aid to understanding rather than subjective evaluation. The critic helps the reader navigate complexities in the text without distorting it through bias. This encourages a more scientific and a respectful approach to literary analysis. Now the next quote. Close attention to the technical elements of the poem, rhythm, rhyme, imagery, is essential to understanding. Richards underscores the inseparability of form and content in poetry. These technical features shape meaning and emotional effect. Recognizing their role helps readers appreciate the poem's artistry. Now the next quote. The danger of halo effect, prior knowledge about the author, can unduly influence interpretations. This warns against letting an author's reputation or biography skew how a poem is read. Such bias may lead to uncritical acceptance or dismissal. Richards advocates for judging the poem on its own merits. Now the next quote. The greatest obstacle to understanding poetry is the reader's unwillingness to accept unfamiliar language. I. Richards stresses that poetic language often challenges everyday understanding and requires effort. Resistance to this challenge can cause misinterpretation. Openness and patience are necessary virtues for readers. Now the next quote. The ambiguity and complexity of poetry reflect the complexity of human experience. This quote ties the nature of poetry to the human condition. It implies that poetry's richness mirrors the nuances of thought and feeling. Understanding poetry thus involves engaging with life's intricacies. Now the next quote. Teaching practical criticism is teaching how to think clearly about language. Richards viewed his method as an intellectual training to improve critical thinking. It is not just about poetry, but about sharpening one's use of language generally. This broadens the educational value of his approach. Now the next quote. The meaning of a poem is inseparable from its mode of expression. This affirms the formalist view that a content and a form are intertwined. The way a poem says something is part of what it means. Ignoring form leads to incomplete understanding. Now the next quote. An impartial critic must recognize his own limitations and avoid hasty judgments. This emphasizes humility and caution in criticism. Recognizing limits prevents premature conclusions and encourages ongoing dialogue. It reframes criticism as a continuous process rather than a final verdict. Now the next quote. The ultimate aim of criticism is to enable the reader to enjoy and understand the poem better. I.A. Richard stresses there, criticism serves readers, helping deepen their appreciation and insight. It is not an elitist exercise, but a democratic one. This humanist perspective grounds criticism in experience and accessibility.